absolutely very important role to play in local content on many fronts. Most obvious one, of course, is that typically in countries with production sharing arrangements, for instance, national company is a joint venture partner with the multinational investor. Now, local content, as I said, only happens when you procure goods and services. Capacity building is a precursor to local content, training of individuals, getting companies up to speed in their systems and processes. Procurement. And procurement really happens at the end of a chain of events. So one, as part of the joint venture operator, the national company has a role to play in the strategies of procurement, strategies of supply development. And of course, national company will build capacity within the local economy by the people it employs and deploys in operations in the joint venture partners. But an important role national companies play is that ultimately oil fields production declines, international investors don't find them attractive anymore and walk away. And the national company stays back and continues operations into the long term. That's when you need the supply chain locally that has a lower cost of overhead costs to continue the activities. As an example, people talk about this oil price decline after a long super cycle, as if it's the first time it happened. It happened before. From 73 to 86, we had 13 years of high oil prices. And then there was a drastic drop off in oil prices. So in the late 80s, multinational companies left Trinidad, service companies left. But over the super cycle, we built a strong supply chain. Companies who could build rigs, drill, modern units, fabrication, construction. We had a full supply chain here. In low oil price time, those companies asked government and the state oil company, could you make opportunities available to us? Small fields, non-productive wells, low profit fields that we can operate on your behalf with our equipment and people at a low cost and keep production moving. And that's exactly what happens today. Those small companies operating those marginal fields produce between 12 and 15% of onshore production in Trinidad. It's a lot. They're the ones who've been increasing production. So a national company, in that case, developed the local supply chain to meet its own needs, and they're the ones who survived during the low oil price regime. Otherwise, the industry would have gone into a tailspin and would have had great difficulty surviving during that downturn. As it turns out, because the industry survived during that downturn from 86 till late 90s, when it picked up again at that time, there were people and service companies who were able to take advantage of the new high price regime of the 90s and early 2000s. Again, we have to keep in mind that the oil and gas industry has very long cycles. And when we look at local content, we must look at it in the point of view of investment for the long term. And that requires a quite strategic approach. And part of that strategy requires a role for all investors, all players. We speak about a national company, but there also is a requirement for the training institutions, for instance, to understand what kinds of skills do we need, how many, when. So we don't, one, under-train or two, over-train, and that people are trained and unemployed. And it's important that analysis of demand and supply is undertaken and made available to the players in that continuum. The companies, the national company, the trading institutions, and all who are involved, even the banks, because financing is a big problem for the oil and gas sector, especially for local companies. In countries and areas where the industry isn't well understood by the financiers. As a result, the cost of financing can be very high or not accessible at all. So getting the supply chain for the suppliers, the banks and so on, to understand the sector, understand the risks, understand what their role is and how they can play is quite important.
Well, because they are owned by the state, no? Then they can define policies that are maybe more adventurous and more risky, no? Than the ones that the private sector would be willing to engage in, no? You can say, for example, if you are a national-owned company, I am going to buy goods and services that maybe are a bit more expensive. The private sector would say, no, I want to be competitive, I'll buy the cheapest, and if the cheapest comes from Germany, and it's cheap and good, I'll buy German or Chinese, no? A national company can say, Well, yes, we are a company, but we are a nationally owned company, so criteria to make decisions is not only short-term immediate financial cost benefit, but it also has to do with public goals. And if a public goal is to develop productive chains, no, and to help establish new entrepreneurial capacities in the private sector, then I can say, well, X percentage of the goods and services that I want to buy or that I need to buy, I will buy them from private sector companies in my country. And yes, maybe the quality is not so good, and yes, maybe the price is not so competitive because they are not massive producers in the world market. Nevertheless, that is a public policy, and there will be other benefits for the nation that are not benefits for the national oil company, but you can create employment, you can generate processes of local accumulation that later can become autonomous and independent and have a life of their own. No? I would say that local content policies regarding labor, I think they should be implemented. I think that especially in the earlier stages of mining or hydrocarbons investments, when you have to build a basic infrastructure, accommodate the terrain, no, build the roads and the this and the that, and you use thousands of unskilled workers, I think it is a very good idea to try to provide jobs first for the locals. Because also because it is possible. You're demanding unskilled workers basically for construction, no? Activities, and most of the labor force in those areas has some kind of experience in that, or that's something that they can easily learn how to do. No? Second, I would say that it would be always interesting to even ask the companies to have some kind of policies to recruit as much as possible local workers in the production phase, where of course you demand much more skilled workers. But I think that if you put in place training processes, no, and you combine highly skilled people from other areas with a program, no, to incorporate local workers, I think that is very, very important, because then you develop skilled workers that can later perform in other areas of life and apply the know-how that they can develop in these kind of industries to other economic sectors once the extractive activity is over, or even before, if they choose, no, to explore opportunities in other sectors. So I would say that if I was to turn experience into policy, I would say that is very important. No? In the third place, I would say local content policies regarding the provision of goods and services, but then you have to have an assessment because you might define or establish a policy saying I want 100% of goods and services to be national, but you can clash with reality, no? So you have to have an assessment of what are the existing capacities in your locality, in your region, or in your country to, in fact, deliver those kinds of goods and services. And experience tells that if they don't exist by the time the investment arrives, it is very difficult to create them by decree, no? Let me maybe provide you a Peruvian example, no? You have the region of Cajamarca, where you have big mining projects happening in an area that was mostly rural, no? That had very weak institutional capacities, that had almost no industry, no? That had no banking, no financial services, no industrial capacities, nothing, no? So when the mine sets up, no, starts operating in the region and starts demanding industrial goods and services, there's nobody to provide it, no? To provide them. and therefore it works as an enclave. If it's going to buy uniforms for the miners, it cannot buy them there because there's no local textile established capacity, and you cannot invent that from the scratch. So they end up buying a lot of their goods and services from Lima, or from larger places, and there is no process therefore of capital accumulation, of productive chains, of value added in that regional economy.
There are mainly three factors that shape the outcome of local content policies. I would say first the history of the sector in the country, and second government regulation and policies, and third the collaboration with the private sector. So what do we mean by that? The history of the sector is obviously important because if you compare and contrast Latin America with Africa, especially sort of like the new producers in East Africa, there's a huge difference in the time that the sector has been around. So Latin American countries like Trinidad and Tobago had a history of more than 100 years of oil extraction, whereas some countries like Kenya, from what I know, only recently discovered their oil resources. So obviously they don't have the skills, sort of like the expertise yet. So they have to build that, and that also has to lower sort of like their expectations of what is actually achievable in terms of content. Which brings me to the second point, which is government regulation. So you really have to look for like a targeted approach that is specific to the country, meaning that the policy targets are not too high, which was, for example, the case in Brazil, which was recently got a lot of bad news for the associated problems. Because what happens if the goal is too high? Then people might just pay somebody in order to not reach the goal because it's just simply not feasible. And then obviously if it's too low, then it doesn't really create any additional benefit. So you really have to find like the sweet spot in the individual country, and to do so, you have to take an assessment of the country's initial conditions. So, for example, through a demand analysis, what is actually going to be procured by the multinational companies, and where are opportunities for local sourcing? And that brings me to the third point, which is collaboration with the private sector. So the government cannot, or it's probably not going to work out if the government just says you have to employ X amount of local people and procure a Y percentage of local goods. If the government doesn't help the private sector to achieve these goals, it's most certainly doomed to fail. So you have to the government has to engage in terms of like supplier development, provide access to finance, require the multinational companies to unbundle their contracts, tell the local suppliers where the opportunities are so that they're actually aware, which they might not be, help them attain the international health and environmental and safety standards, which especially in the oil and gas industry are very high. So unless those requirements are met, the multinational companies are hardly going to collaborate with local suppliers because it's just too much of a risk. Also, quality is very important. So you have to do a gap analysis in terms of what is the current level of capacity and capability that these local suppliers have, and also local employees, and then what is feasible within the given amount of time that you can bridge in terms of capacity building and helping out these people.
That local content policies in Angola, in Nigeria, and in other African countries are being pursued in a kind of a disorganized or untargeted way. The concern that I have is that states are not offering enough leadership in terms of setting development priorities, coordinating to ensure regulators in the extractive sector are working to a larger strategy for economic growth and industrial development. A key aspect of local content is this picking of industries and in sectors that you're going to construct new comparative advantage in. And this can work very well in the case of steel in India or shipbuilding in South Korea or Brazil. But if you take Nigeria, for example, the local content law there sets targets across a very broad range of something like 280 separate categories of oil services. So no country, not even an advanced developed country, is going to be able to construct new comparative advantage in 280 separate categories of oil services. And I think it will be very hard to foster companies that, after a period of protection and nurturing, are going to be globally competitive. So I think countries need to be a little more targeted in terms of what areas they encourage linkages. If every country follows the same development strategy anyway, then none of them are going to be very successful. So countries should concentrate on different strategies to build different forms of comparative advantage, and then perhaps maybe work more with each other to support what their neighbors are doing.